My father loved golf. He didn't particularly like golfers or country clubs. So in his later years, he played the purest form of the game, pasture pool. And he was always happy when I cut and baled the hay, because then he could go out and practice his long game. And Dad tried to teach me, but I did not take the golf or pasture pool. But I do remember one thing he said: keep your eye on the ball. We in agriculture are not very good at keeping our eye on the ball. We get distracted over issues that have little to do with being fairly compensated for the food that we raise. And in particular, our attention wanders when prices get a little bit better. Part of the problem that we face is that we're fractured into quite a large number of organizations, and some of them with really radically conflicting notions. And too many of those nations that claim to represent us have drank the corporate Kool-Aid, and they make it their mission to defend the global corporations, and they just throw the family farmers under the bus. But even amongst the organizations which honestly advocate for family agriculture, we have trouble maintaining cohesion. Each organization has its own priorities, and they're all competing for the same members and for the same finance sources. Inevitably, it's diluting our overall influence. So some days I'm kind of fed up with this dysfunction and mad at how our fragmented representation is exploited to prevent reform, even the smallest, most common sense. But on those days, I remind myself that it's better to have a number of ideas and initiatives advocating for family agriculture. It's a lot like a marketplace. The more buyers and sellers, the better. It might be an attractive idea to have just one organization representing all of our interests, but ultimately that's a dangerous notion. But what we do need instead is better cooperation and coordination. I've been a member of OCM since its founding. You have the best name of any organization. Competitive markets, that's what it's all about. Only through competitive markets can the true value of an item or service be determined. The price that is fair for both the seller and the buyer. The problem we have in agriculture is that most of the major branches of production no longer have competitive markets. And the scary part is that farmers have grown accustomed to it. Take the field crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, barley. Ultimately, the grain farmers look to the government for a subsidy check. This has become their de facto farm policy. Keep the government checks coming. Today they call it crop insurance, but it's still a government welfare. And I see no movement from the farmers to make ADM, Bunge, Cargill, or Dreyfus buy in a competitive market. There does not seem to be a grassroots plan to have a national reserve that would control the spikes in production and prices. This nation used to have a strategic reserve, but instead we've turned the entire marketing over to the global merchants of grain, and they have no incentive to match supply with demand. Overproduction of corn and soybeans is the crux of the problem for those of us in animal agriculture. Cheap corn results in cheap chickens, pork, milk, and beef. And yet for then many animals that we are feeding this cheap corn, we cannot use it all up. Ethanol and exports are the only other ways to deal with the excess corn and soybeans. The problem that we're facing is that ethanol is being phased out. and demand for our corn, soybeans, and wheat in foreign countries is fickle. The promise that American farmers would profit by feeding the world always was and still is a lie. So how are we going to deal with even cheaper corn that will be coming in the next decade? Reliance on export for better corn, soybeans, and wheat prices has been our official farm policy for 40 years. And as I said, it never worked. At least it never worked for the farmers or for the taxpayers. But it's great for ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus. These are complex issues that need to be addressed in our farm policy, but I see no desire or movement coming from the grain farmers to counter the overproduction or restore competitive markets. As I said, subsidy checks seems to be their only plan. We all know what happened to the chicken industry after Tyson invented the factory farm. Chicken farmers became serfs on their own land. But as far as I see, chicken farmers don't see a future in the restoration of a competitive market system. Such markets used to exist. Independent chicken processing businesses were located in every community in America. Instead, contract chicken producers pin their hopes for fair treatment on better enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act. And I hope they're right that the new GIPSA rules will give them the protection they deserve. But what the new GIPSA rules will not do is restore their independence. Chicken farmers lost their independent competitive markets by the 1970s. But it was not until the 1990s that the hog producers were also vertically integrated. Back in the 70s, there were 1 million hog farmers. Today, we have 66,000. And nearly none of those are independent. Seemingly overnight, the competitive market infrastructure was pulled out from under them. The hog industry was vertically integrated, with Tyson, JBS, and Smithfield now controlling 70% of the total market. So what happened? One thing that did not happen is that hog farmers did not defend their access to an independently operated, transparent, competitive market. So today, hog farmers are looking for protection from enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act. In other words, the new GIPSA rules. Do you hear that, Andy? They're all looking for you. The GIPSA rules are an issue that OCM knows very well. It was a member of OCM, Dudley Butler, who was administrator of the grain inspection at Packers and Stockyards under Obama. And Dudley did his level best to interpret the Packers and Stockyards Act as fair and robust as possible. He ran up against the industry, who fought him over every single word. By the end of the Obama administration, the GIPSA rules, as first proposed by Dudley, were watered down. But even that was too much for the cartel, so they had Trump just eliminate them. So now we have Andy Green, assisted by Dr. Robert Taylor, trying to reinstate the GIPSA rules and running into the same industry opposition. The lesson is that chicken and hog farmers may never receive justice by relying on USDA and Congress. Only by marketing their chickens and hogs through an independent, transparent, and competitive market can farmers receive the true value for their labor. But can the poultry and hog industry restore the competitive market system? I don't know. It certainly would be tough, but they won't if they don't try. Once upon a time, in every community in this country, which was surrounded by a ring of family dairies, which supplied the consumers with fresh milk, cream, and butter. Now, mega dairies are concentrated in the middle of the Californian irrigation system, where the worst drought in 1,200 years has cut the flows of water. Farmers in cities are fighting over what's left. As I say, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. But out there in the middle of those irrigation districts, huge piles of manure, which threatens everyone downstream. Meanwhile, the hills and valleys of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and New York are going back to brush. This is because the family dairy farmers located there can no longer survive. And if I understand what happened, and Mike tried to explain it to me, dairy farmers formed cooperatives to fight for a fair price. But the co-ops merged, got bigger, and somehow the co-op farmers lost control of their own co-ops. And just like chicken and hog producers, dairy farmers are now serfs on their own land. The largest co-op of all, Dairy Farmers of America, controls 25–30% of the market. Under this system, the mega dairies get bigger while the family dairies go broke. Milk is perishable. The more perishable the food, the more important it is to be able to match the supply with the demand. At one point in our nation's history, this was understood. Dairies were regulated as a kind of public utility. But the neoliberal economists looked at this with horror, and under their influence, we stopped trying to match the supply with demand. The result is that no one, except for the co-op executives, big processors, and retail giants, can profit from selling milk. It seems that only the cattle industry aspires to protect competitive markets. Not only do cattlemen aspire to protect what's left of a fair and transparent competitive market system, we have proposed laws to accomplish this. Country of origin labeling, which would help differentiate beef born and raised in the USA from beef that has been imported. Unlike other sectors of American agriculture, the cattle ranchers do not produce a surplus. We have to import in order to oversupply the market. Another thing that we're also working on, Cattlemen, is for the inclusion in the new GIPSA rules, a ruling that a cattle feeder does not need to prove economic harm to the entire cattle industry when arguing a case for personal discrimination. And finally, we propose captive supply reform, which would stop the use of non-priced alternative market agreements, also known as AMAs or captive supplies, which now controls 80%, are now about 80% of the market and undermining price discovery. The solution is really quite simple. Do what they did in 1921. Requires that the packing cartel purchases their fed cattle in a transparent and competitive form. The Western Organization of Resource Councils, WORC, WORC, proposed such a rule in 1996, and OCM was among the first organizations to endorse what was then known as the WORC rule. Ultimately, USDA refused to follow through, but the proposal is still viable and currently being discussed in USDA and the White House. We heard the need to protect what is left of competition in the cattle markets gets more and more critical as each year passes. Just over the past 25 years, 83,000 independent feedlots have gone broke, 48,000 of them in just the last 10. And while independent feedlots disappear, the number of very large feedlots have increased from 45 to 77. And these large feedlots now feed 35% of all the cattle. In his recent paper, Dr. Robert Taylor asked, well, how can this be? If year after year, the cost of feeding cattle is greater than the value of the gain, why is it that large feeders get bigger while smaller feeders fail? After all, the feed costs and the initial cost for the feeder calves are the same for both. Operating efficiencies cannot be that dissimilar. The only logical conclusion is that the actual market is not what is reported to USDA. There's some kind of kickback or premium available to the large vertically aligned feedlots. And so it's clear that the push for full vertical integration of independent feeders is on. Independent feeders are facing the same situation that hog farmers did in the 1990s. Their only hope to avoid vertical integration is for captive supply reform to become law. Meanwhile, us cow-calf producers, the attrition has been less severe. There are still some 700,000 farms raising cattle. However, we're losing ranches at a rate of 17,000 a year. In Montana, we see it in smaller ranches being absorbed by larger neighbors. And in fact, that's my case. I'm now semi-retired and leasing most of my place to a younger guy. And I say younger, he's over 50 years old. My other alternative is to sell to a billionaire neighbor who's eager to add to his 200,000 acre private hunting reserve. In my part of central Montana, the millionaires and billionaires are buying every acre where elk can be found. While I've said that we need to restore competitive markets to all of agriculture, not just the cattle industry, we need to reflect a little bit about what that might look like. What constitutes a competitive market for a perishable product like milk under conditions of chronic overproduction? The central problem is that, as I said, in this country is the overproduction of corn and soybeans. Cheap corn results in cheap chicken, cheap pork, cheap milk, and cheap beef. And I don't think that most of us, even farmers, appreciate how concentrated and vulnerable our agricultural system has really become. Today, 209,007, according to USDA, farms produce 78.7% of the food. But do you hear that? Although there are 2 million farms, 10% of them produce 80% of the food. And the majority of those larger farms are doing so in a non-transparent, non-competitive market. These farms are essentially already vertically integrated. They may be large, but they're serfs on their own land. Except that about a third of the land they don't even own, that's leased. Add in the fact that we can't depend upon the predictability of the weather anymore. When you can't plan for your next crop, this is a problem. Currently, our country does produce more food than the American consumers can eat. But what happens in the future when the weather continues to get more and more unstable? The only way to successfully farm under difficult climatic conditions is to be flexible and diversified. But industrial agriculture demands the opposite of flexibility and is predicated upon monocropping. The disruptions that we saw in the beef and pork supply chain over this COVID pandemic was just a warning of what's to come. So, in closing, I just want to remind everyone that we have some very important initiatives being considered in Congress and by the administration. But unless our ag organizations unite behind them, they will go nowhere. The American Beef Labeling Act, which would restore COOL, is stalled with only 10 co-sponsors in the Senate and 2 in the House. The big problem in moving COOL is that the Cattle Price Discovery and Transparency Act is sucking the oxygen out of the Senate and House Ag committees. I don't think that it would ever happen, but on this case, I'm on the same side as the NCBA. The Cattle Price Discovery and Transparency Act is a bad idea that will not restore competition. The original concept would have required that packers buy half of their fed cattle on the spot market. But after Congress had their say, the actual bill is complex and requires an extensive USDA bureaucracy. The National Farmers Union and the U.S. Cattlemen's Association are the main proponents, but they failed to consult the rest of us. The upshot is that we're not united or over prioritizing COOL, such as not getting the attention to get Congress to pass it. And if country of origin labeling is not passed in this Congress, it may never be passed. COOL may not fully restore a competitive market, but it is a step in the right direction. And it is the right thing to do. Consumers have the right to know the origin of their beef purchases, and we ranchers have the right to a fair and transparent market. We've not been keeping our eye on the ball. The other major focus in the work of is revigorating the Packers and Stockyards Administration, and the move to authorize for an office of Special Investigator for Competitive Matters is a good idea and has already passed the Senate and House Ag committees. Naturally, the NCBA opposes an investigator who focuses on competition. So it is good to see that the NCBA has reverted back to being reliably wrong. But also in the works, as Andy Green was telling us, are the new gypsy rules. And we hope that they will be robust, but USDA is already a year behind schedule, evidence that the opposition is considerable. Now, I've been part of a coalition having conversations with USDA to include captive supply reform within the rulemaking, and Andy has confirmed that they are considering it. I've taken up a chunk of your time, and I hope my remarks have provoked some debate over some very difficult and complex issues that don't have simple answers to. And unless we talk about the future of agriculture and the future of the rural communities in which we live, we will continue to be captive to a handful of global corporations. If that is the case, this country could be facing some very, very hard times. It's up to us, members of OCM and the other allied groups, to advocate for the future of family agriculture. No one else will. So keep your eyes focused on what is most important. Keep your eyes on the ball. Thank you.